North Carolina State University. Additional funding is provided by the North Carolina Nursery and Landscape Association and the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, presenting TarHeelGardening.com, your online gardening resource for North Carolina plants, professional advice, and more. And by Appalachian Naturescapes, custom landscape designs specializing in Blue Ridge native landscape themes. From intimate gardens to elaborate outdoor living spaces. AppalachianNaturescapes.com.
Coming up, a fight to save endangered plants and a mission to cultivate seasoned gardeners. Next. Hi, welcome to In the Garden. I'm Bryce Lane. Today, we're visiting the State Botanical Gardens of Georgia. Located just a few miles from the University of Georgia in Athens, this 313-acre preserve offers a bit of nature at every turn. From the themed gardens and tropical conservatory to the peaceful miles of hiking trails. The State Botanical Garden of Georgia was founded in 1968, and it has a very unique and interesting relationship with the University of Georgia and the community.
Hi, welcome to the garden. This is great.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Yeah, the State Botanical Garden of Georgia, it is the State Botanical Garden of Georgia, and it's part of UGA, but it's part of public service and outreach. We're a land-grant university, and so we have a mandate to be a part of the community as well as, of course, of academia. So we are about a 45-year-old garden, see about 200,000 people through the gates, and we do everything from display to research to education of the youngest to the oldest. Wow. We're a full meal deal, I suppose.
Well, let's talk first, Wilf, about the display. If I came to this garden, what are some of the unique and interesting gardens that you have as display gardens?
Well, there's lots, and it really depends what time of year you come. Because in the springtime, of course, the shade garden is fabulous with the camellias and the azaleas and the hellebores, fabulous. And then just below that, there's the native garden. Of course, that's at the pinnacle in the spring and early summer. We have the flower garden, which is probably one of the more formal gardens, and we're standing in this right now. Yeah. Full of color, very dedicated to pollinators and color and groups of plants. But there's the herb garden and the physic garden, and then the international garden where you can walk around the world basically. And then people have been gardening here for many, many years, and so the heritage garden where you can see old row crops. As long as the deer don't get them.
Well, there's plenty to see. I can see that just with a very brief overview. Talk about some of the research. I know you're working a lot with conservation of plants and native plants.
Well, certainly. Conservation is one of our main emphasis here. We have a large flora in Georgia, but we also have quite a few plants that are rare, threatened, or endangered. And so we're part of what's called the Georgia Rare Plant Alliance, or Plant Conservation Alliance. We do a lot of ex situ or off-site conservation where we grow plants in protection, but we also do a lot of reintroduction of those plants that we've successfully reared back into their native habitat. And so we work with a whole bunch of people right there across the state, and really I think there's 40 other institutions and facilities involved in the Georgia Plant Conservation Alliance. So it's a really happening organization. And then the other part is, can we start working with our industry to get native plants more into the trade through our Native Plant Initiative? And that's a very exciting new prospect.
Now, you did mention education. You have a number of educational programs where you actually use the garden for that purpose?
Well, certainly. Within the university, there's something like, I think 50, 55 different courses that come out and use the garden. But of course, we'll take them from tots right the way through to graduation. Lots of different people coming for lots of different courses, everything from pretty academic. We have the certificate in native plants to try and make people more aware, to engage people in the wonderful flora of Georgia. And we also do that at the coast, at Savannah.
Well, that's amazing.
And so we want to, with a state botanical garden, we need to take this garden statewide.
Well, Wolf, we really appreciate you giving us that thumbnail. And now, for us, it's really, it's a time to go and take a look at the garden and see what we can bring home to our own home gardens. Thanks so much for hosting.
Well, you're so welcome, and thanks for being here.
When you come to the State Botanical Garden of Georgia, be sure to check out the herb garden. It's a big, beautiful garden filled with those familiar plants that we call herbs. Now, many of you might be wondering, what is actually an herb? Well, the technical definition of an herb is an herbaceous perennial or annual made up of totally herbaceous parts, no woody parts at all. Now, herbs have a long history of being used for a number of different things. We're probably most familiar with the culinary herbs. Those are herbaceous plants that we use in cooking. We're using parts of plants to flavor the food that we prepare. Culinary herbs are just a small part of herb gardening. Then there are the medicinal herbs. Now, medicinal herbs date way, way back, where some of the first gardens were actually herbal gardens for medicinal purposes. These are plants that we use parts of those plants for medicinal purposes, for healing and for taking care of illness. Now, herbs can be used for a number of different things. Dyes, oils, teas, even fragrances to enhance even where we live, like a potpourri, classic example. Well, it's not uncommon that in ancient times, all those herbs were planted in a garden. And that garden was called a kitchen garden or an herb garden. And this is a perfect example of an herb garden. Now remember, folks, if you were to grow your own herb garden, and you can grow herbs anywhere in your garden, that you can also include other herbaceous plants and even woody plants that don't have herbal qualities. Now what I'd like to do is show you a few of the unique and interesting herbs that are growing here in this herb garden. Now this is a very cool little plant. This is called Saponaria officinalis, common name soapwort or bouncing bet. And I'll get back to that name here in a minute. But here's an herbaceous perennial that spreads by rhizomes. It has leaves on it that are used for herbal purposes. Soapwort has been used for years to make soap. You take the leaves and crush them, and it makes a very mild soap. And in fact, it's been used for centuries for cleaning. What's so unique about the soap that's made from soapwort is that it works very well with those kinds of fabrics that are very delicate and don't need a strong soap. So that's where it got the name soapwort, and that's how it's used. You either use the crushed leaves or the small rhizomes that are responsible for its spreading. Now folks, if you look at this planting, you can see that it spreads very readily by rhizomes, and that's something you need to be careful of if you're going to grow Saponaria. But it grows about 12 to 15 inches tall, and in the early to midsummer it produces an inflorescence. You can see these white to lavender flowers in clusters, kind of like a geranium, growing here on the ends of the stems. It's a great herbal plant to use even if you don't choose to use it to make soap. Now back to the bouncing bet. That's an ancient term to describe laundry lady. So you can see where this plant got that kind of humorous common name, bouncing bet, laundry lady, soapwort. Another great group of plants for the herb garden are the scented geraniums, and I suspect many of you have grown scented geraniums. Now this is geranium. Pelargonium is the genus, just like the flowering geraniums we use in our garden, but these generally do not flower, and we don't grow them for that purpose. Now as an herb, they have leaves that are highly scented. If you brush up against the leaf or you rub that leaf and smell your fingers, all different kinds of scents. Lemon, rose, all different types of scents that can be used in a number of different ways. One of the most fascinating recipes I've heard about scented geranium is you take the leaves of a scented geranium and you place it on the bottom of a cake pan. You make an angel food cake with that scent infused into it. I'm not sure how good that would taste. I guess it would depend on the scent that you might choose. But folks, if you look at the leaves, you can see they're very unique and interesting as a garden plant. Some are dark green leaves and highly dissected, some variegated with light colored leaves, even some with large, broad leaves, all having a different scent. They're much a conversation piece for the garden. Not only that, but these leaves can be used in potpourri, for accenting oils and vinegars, lots of real good uses for the scented geraniums. Full sun, well-drained soil, and they'll grow just fine. The only thing you might need to do is deadhead or pinch back the stems to get them to bush out. Now I've got to just say a shout out for basil. We've got to have basil in our gardens. Lots of different cultivars, even purple basils. This one I just happened to notice they've let the flower stalks come. Now we use basil to use in cooking, and especially for pesto, which is some of my favorite. But this leaf on this basil smells almost kind of licorice-like, and that's really unique and interesting. Notice the interesting texture that are between the two. Okay, now let's talk about the sages. Now the sages come from a genus called Salvia. It's a huge genus of plants with hundreds and hundreds of species, floral species and culinary or herbal species. Now Salvia officinalis is the classic culinary salvia, which has been used in cooking for years. This is one of the more common cultivars called Burgarten. And if you look at it, you can see it's a low-growing salvia with a broad leaf and has kind of a textured leaf on it, bluish green. From this Salvia officinalis, we get your purple salvias and your variegated salvias. But this is what's called culinary salvia, and these leaves are used in cooking. Now, salvia, the sage, has that classic history of being used in stuffing at Thanksgiving, and that's where I remember, that sage flavor in stuffing. But it can be used to flavor butters and breads and a number of other types of things you can use with this salvia. As an ornamental plant, I find it just beautiful, even though we don't select it for its flowers. You see a well-drained soil, full sun location, leaves are a bluish green, and it'll grow about 12 to 15 inches tall and mound. A mass planting in a mixed border for Salvia officinalis, and you've got a lovely addition to your herb garden. No home garden would be complete without the mints. That's the genus Mentha. And these herbs add a lot to the garden. Not only as you walk by and brush against them and get that aroma of mint, but we can use the leaves to infuse teas and iced teas and hot teas. Lots of different types of uses of the mints. There's chocolate mint, there's spearmint, lots of different types of mints. And this one is a variegated mint. And if you look at it, you can see it has that variegated leaf, which adds an ornamental quality about it. Here's peppermint, a little dwarf peppermint with a small flower stalk. And folks, you don't have to let the flowers come, you can deadhead them. The mints are fantastic. In fact, they're so easy to grow, they have one bad habit. They can infiltrate and take over a garden area. They spread by underground stems and they start popping up everywhere. Pretty soon you're ready to get rid of all your mint because they're so invasive. So here's a real easy little tip for the home garden. Plant your mints in containers. Now by planting them in containers, you completely and totally limit them from spreading into the rest of the garden. And you can take these containers and place them strategically even in the garden. That's something that a lot of people haven't done yet in the garden, and that's put the containers in the garden, not just have them on a patio. Not only do mints really respond well in containers, but bee balm is another one, the genus Monarda. The bee balm's a great herbal plant to have in the garden, but it spreads like crazy too. So here's a nice little garden tip for you to consider. Put them in containers. Now, everyone's saying, well, what's the best container? Clay versus plastic? Doesn't really matter. As long as it has a drainage hole, use well-drained potting soil, all these plants will thrive in these containers. Located not far from the herb garden is the physic garden. Now the physic garden is a collection of medicinal plants. And folks, collections of medicinal plants have occurred for centuries. In fact, the first botanical gardens in the world were medicinal plants in gardens of medical schools in Europe in the 15 and 1600s. They started by collecting plants that had medicinal value and did research on them. From that, what we know as the botanical garden today exists, which is quite fascinating. Now let's take a common ornamental plant that we grow in our own landscape and talk about its medicinal value. That's Echinacea purpurea, the purple coneflower, and there's a wonderful planting right here. Well, Echinacea purpurea, lots of cultivars, the classic purple coneflower with the purple ray flowers and those orange disc flowers, attracts hummingbirds, butterflies, grows in full sun, drought tolerant. It's a great landscape plant. Not only does Echinacea have a great ornamental value in the home landscape, it also has medicinal qualities. In fact, there are compounds in the leaves and stems that have antibacterial and antiviral capabilities. And so oftentimes you can use a dietary supplement that contains echinacea extract that helps to ward off a cold or shorten the symptoms of that cold or virus that you might get. You don't have to go to the store and buy them all the time. You can actually create a tea, or a tincture as it's called, which is a fluid extract from the very plants that you have growing in your own garden. Now, another common plant that we grow, a woody plant, which is ginkgo biloba. And perhaps many of you take ginkgo biloba supplement. Now, ginkgo biloba has a compound that comes out of its leaves that cause the blood vessels in your brain to dilate, to get larger, increasing the blood flow to your brain. That's why it's advertised as a memory enhancer. Well, you can use the same kind of a recipe for your ginkgo biloba leaves from your own trees to create the same kind of a tincture that you could use to improve the circulation in your brain. These are just two examples of how ornamental plants that we use in our own home landscape can be also used for medicinal purposes. This is Heather Alley, the conservation horticulturist at the State Botanical Garden at Georgia, and she's in charge of the Center for Native Plant Studies. Now, Heather, what does the Center for Native Plant Studies really focus on?
We focus on growing plants for three major functions. The first one, which was the first thing we started learning about, was growing rare, threatened, and endangered plants for conservation. And then we started realizing that not only do rare plants need protection, but really all native plants are losing ground as we develop our state. So, so we then started growing even common native plants for habitat restoration and also to show homeowners new and interesting plants that they could use in their landscape and try to promote native plants in general.
Well, speaking of promoting native plants, this is a really important topic. You know, I'm a home gardener and I've heard all about how great native plants are, but you tell me, what are the real reasons why we should be considering using more natives in our home landscapes?
That's a great question. It's my favorite question because for a long time people have been saying, oh, native plants are more adapted to our environment and they're drought tolerant and disease tolerant. But the real more exciting and compelling reason, which has come out through pretty new research, they're learning native plants are the major food source for insects, beneficial insects, and then that's the baseline of the whole food chain or food web. So without native plants, you don't support our native flora and fauna.
Right. Then your bird populations as well. And
right.
Yeah, so native plants are really important when it comes to restoring those contrived environments that we live in, you know, in bringing the insects and the animals back. So what do you do here? Do you try to increase stock of the native plants and get them distributed? How does that work?
That's one thing. We do a lot in a small space, but one of the things, like you said, is to produce seeds for locally adapted plants, and usually that would be for a large landowner like the Department of Transportation or Forest Service to revegetate a large portion of land with locally adapted, we call them local ecotypes. So those are plants that would be adapted to Georgia, not Alabama, not North Carolina, and there really are adaptive differences. And so we are working to produce seeds to get those landscapes back in a native.
Well, now, Heather, as I look around these endangered native plants, I look down and I see a familiar plant, one actually that I've grown in my garden. So tell me the story behind this one.
Yes, this is the royal catchfly. It has a congener that's widespread or in the same genus. This is a different species, and this is Regia, or royal catchfly, and I think called because of that vibrant red color. But this is from the only last population of this species in Georgia, way in northwest Georgia, near Chattanooga. And it, again, was just, they would call it narrowly endemic, or from a small region. In this case, or in the case of a lot of plants, just at the southern tip of its range, associated with the Appalachian Mountains. And so one population left that we're
And so it's
safeguarding.
a relative of the one I grow then?
Yes,
Yeah.
first cousins.
Okay, so give me 2 recommendations for native plants that home gardeners should have in their garden.
One of our favorite plants that we're promoting is Georgia aster, and it is a beautiful, bigger than usual and deeper purple than usual aster. Really does well without much rain and the climate that we've been seeing for the past 5 years. And pretty special because it blooms really late into the fall, like all the way into Thanksgiving.
Which is really nice. Yeah.
So that's a neat thing to have that late in the fall.
And your second?
I don't have a specific plant in mind, but I really recommend any sort of plant that's adapted for our prairie or savanna environment. Lots of sun, great for pollinators, they're heavy bloomers, and again, tolerate our drier summers.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And folks, really the message here is do your homework, study the native plants, study your native region, and then make selections according to where you live, not where someone else does, to pick the best possible plants to encourage your ecosystem and have a beautiful garden. Plants have the unique ability to absorb lots of water and hold soil in place, thus reducing erosion. Now folks, if you've got a steep bank that's subject to washouts after a heavy rain, that's a big problem. The #1 pollutant in water is sediment. Hard to believe, but sediment really creates a problem. And when you get a lot of stormwater runoff off areas of soil, you can lose a lot of soil and add a lot of pollution. Now, turfgrass works all right. The problem with turfgrass, there are 2 things. One, that if it rains hard enough, the water will run right on top of the plant and not be absorbed fast enough. And number 2, it's very difficult to mow. If you look at a slope like this, you could see that mowing this would create quite a problem. But there are lots of other plants that we can use in mass planting that increase the ability of that bank to stay put and prevent that erosion losses and also look beautiful. Take, for instance, this plant here. This is Eragrostis. This is called lovegrass, and it's a genus that has a number of species of ornamental grasses. You can see that this plant grows about 18 to 24 inches with long leaves that are wispy that blow in the breeze. And what an incredible mass planting here at the State Botanical Garden of Georgia. They've got a huge bank planted in lovegrass, and then they've got fruit trees planted amongst that. But when there's a heavy rain, you don't get much sedimental losses in the runoff. See, the water comes down and the grasses have very fibrous root system that holds that soil in place. In addition, if you look closely at the soil surface, you can see a thatch, dead grass pieces that have fallen off the plant that are laying on the ground, and that helps to mitigate the splash factor that you get when it rains hard. It absorbs that water without dislodging the soil. So folks, consider using a lot of different types of ornamental grasses in those hard to grow places where you could have big washout, lots of sediment, and lots of pollution. Our plant of the week was suggested to us by Connie Cottingham, a staff member right here at the Gardens. Folks, please remember to send in your suggestions for a plant of the week to our website or our Facebook page. And if we use it on the show, we'll send you an In the Garden t-shirt. Now, Connie suggested a great herbaceous perennial, Nepeta phacenii Walker's Low, the Walker's Low catmint. Now, catmint is not catnip, and so it won't attract cats. It's a great herbaceous perennial that grows about 36 inches tall, somewhere between 2 and 3 feet tall, mounded. It doesn't spread out like a lot of mints do in the garden, and that's a good thing. Now, let's take a look at the plant. It has this mounded habit of growth with arching branches and a bluish-green colored leaf that's aromatic. Then at the end of the stems, you see beautiful blue flowers, and those will start flowering right after the chance of killing frost, and they'll flower all summer long into the fall until the next killing frost. Makes a great clumped plant for a mixed border and for an herb garden. It's a wonderful plant. It was the PPA, that's the Perennial Plant Association Plant of the Year in 2007, and this plant was discovered on someone's home garden in England back in 1988, brought over here to the United States. This is a great plant of the week, Nepeta phacenii Walker's Low, the Walker's Low catmint. Well, folks, that's about all the time we have for this week, but we'd like to thank everyone at the State Botanical Gardens of Georgia for their hospitality and a great visit. So until next time, I'll be looking for you in the garden.
To register for In the Garden, the course, call NC State's Distance Education Program at 1-866-GO-STATE. That's 1-866-467-8283, or log on to distance.ncsu.edu. For more information about the program or to suggest a plant of the week, go to unctv.org/inthegarden.
Funding for In the Garden is made possible through the financial contributions of viewers like you, who invite you to join them in supporting UNC-TV. And by North Carolina State University. Additional funding is provided by the North Carolina Nursery and Landscape Association and the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, presenting TarHeelGardening.com, your online gardening resource for North Carolina plants, professional advice, and more. And by Appalachian Naturescapes, custom landscape designs specializing in Blue Ridge native landscape themes. From intimate gardens to elaborate outdoor living spaces. AppalachianNaturescapes.com.